So today on the podcast, we're going to talk about what's new at the Florida Resort this year for the winter holidays and what's changed. We'll also talk about how the current range of holiday offerings fit into the long-time history of the Florida Resort, and we're going to talk about Jollywood nights over at Hollywood Studios. I've been to 2 of the first 3 Jollywood nights. As with most experiences, I wanted to go to it at least twice to understand it and give it a fair review. Usually the second visit doesn't matter much in terms of these reviews. That new restaurant over at Epcot Shikisai, I went there 3 times before we talked about it on the podcast last month, mainly so I could sample widely from the menu. But the overall tone of the review would have been the same if I had only visited it once. 90% of the time, this second visit doesn't matter at all. But boy, it mattered here. We'll talk about what's working and maybe what's not at Jollywood nights, and how this event is a departure from other experiences at the resort. I've talked to a number of people who not only planned the event but also worked that first night, and I now have a handle on what went wrong and, more importantly, why. I'm guessing a number of people that listen to this podcast already know that the first night was a fiasco, probably the largest misstep for the resort in years. It was the culmination of a number of small problems that quickly snowballed into a public relations nightmare. I have some behind-the-scenes stories. Also, I can point to the underlying rationale that resulted in some of these issues on Jollywood's first night, as well as the fallout and how the park attempted to fix them. But to put all of this in context, our episode today will have 3 parts. First, we'll look at the corporate history of holiday parties and hard-ticket events in both California and Florida. Second, we'll look at this year's Mickey's Very Merry, along with some tips for that if you plan to attend. And third, I'll tell you the story of Jollywood nights. We've got a lot to cover, so if your Thanksgiving leftovers are all stored in the fridge, if you've finished off your Black Friday and Cyber Monday shopping, if you're back at work but already counting down the days to the next break, let's go. Let's start with this. The history of the resort's signature winter event, Mickey's Very Merry Christmas Party, which extends back decades. I've seen a lot of talk online in recent years discussing how Disney is moving to a system where it sells its parks twice a day. Once to day guests, and then a second time to evening guests with a hard ticket event or a private party. But this is not a new practice. It's been going on for decades, stretching back to the time of Walt himself. The 2 main events that started Disneyland's ongoing hard ticket events are Dixieland at Disneyland and Date Night at Disneyland. Dixieland at Disneyland was an annual event starting in 1960 in which Disney brought big bands to its parks on weekend nights with spectacular shows in Carnation Gardens, the Golden Horseshoe Saloon, and on boats out on the river. By 1960, most of the big band leaders were in semi-retirement. Dixieland at Disneyland was a way to celebrate and highlight the stars of the 1930s and 1940s, both introducing them to a new audience and creating show venues for adults to fondly remember the music of their youth. Dixieland at Disneyland was also the precursor to the shows at the American Gardens Theater in Epcot, where adults now can fondly remember the music of their own youth. The Dixieland at Disneyland event back then was priced initially at $4.50, which included all shows and attractions except for the shooting gallery. $4.50 was roughly what it cost to go to Disneyland during the day as well. An adult admission with 10 ride tickets was $3.75. An adult admission to the park with 15 ride tickets was $4.50. The operation for the event was fairly straightforward. Disneyland closed to day guests at 7 p.m. An operations team guided guests towards Main Street where they were slowly nudged out of the park exits. In 1960s, no cast members used wristbands or electronic tickets to identify which guest paid for a hard ticket event. Instead, a line of cast members holding a long velvet rope that crossed the width of Main Street simply moved them down the street until everyone was on the other side of the train station. Then evening guests were allowed to enter the park at 8 p.m. The gap between the 7 p.m. park closing and the 8 p.m. special event allowed bands to set up on stages around the park. The other event that started all of this was Date Night at Disneyland, and this one is a little trickier to follow because it has two distinct phases. Date Nights at Disneyland began in 1957. The event started at the request of city officials in Anaheim looking for ways to occupy teenagers on Friday nights over the summer. But this was not initially a hard ticket event. Disneyland simply designated Date Night as an evening where it extended regular park hours, typically to midnight, and hired dance bands to play on stages throughout the park. It proved to be so popular that halfway through that first summer, it was expanded to Friday and Saturday nights, and though it was initially scheduled only for summer, it was extended well into fall. For years, it remained as a type of an extended hours event open to all guests. And then in 1964, Disneyland began special date nights, such as Spring Fling, which featured at least some bands that appealed to younger audiences, with surf rock and folk music. Advance tickets were $4.50, and at Disneyland on the night of the event they were $5.50, again with all shows and attractions included. And from this point moving forward, Disneyland had hard ticket events regularly throughout the years. In the 1960s, many of these events were focused on music, so the idea of selling a park twice in the same day is nothing new, nor is it something that Walt would have opposed, at least in its general sense, though there are differences between the hard ticket events of Walt's lifetime and those today. Out in Florida, the first Mickey's Very Merry started 40 years ago, back in 1983. It was held for just one night, on December 16th from 8 p.m. until 1 a.m. Unlike today, the Christmas season at Disney World lasted just 2 weeks and one weekend. Typically the week before Christmas and then the week after as well. That was it. So Mickey's Very Merry was an event to begin the Christmas season on a Friday night, largely for locals, before traditional tourists descended on the resort beginning on that Saturday. The party was the first presentation of the Christmas parade and the holiday show before they were presented to the general public during regular operating hours in the weeks that followed. Also, unlike today, the event was priced at $13.95 for adults and $9.95 for children, which back then meant children under 12 years old. Again, the pricing for this hard ticket event was close to, in this case a little less than, a one-day ticket to the Magic Kingdom, which in 1983 was $17. The event was arranged as a party, as though Mickey was inviting you over to his kingdom, where just as at a neighborhood party, the host provided everything you would need for the night. There was literally nothing extra that you needed to buy. Included with admission were cookies, hot apple cider, and hot chocolate, as well as complimentary photos, which back in 1983 meant photos printed on photographic paper and sent to you, along with a keepsake ornament. Children also received stockings filled with small gifts. The park presented 15 marching bands, mostly from local high schools, 12 choirs or groups of carolers, a few bell choirs, a musical show called A Sparkling Christmas Spectacular, which was performed in front of the castle, the holiday version of Fantasy on Parade, and the fireworks, along with all of the usual rides and attractions. The event was held only on that one day. It was marketed towards families with children, and even factoring in for inflation, it was a tremendous bargain. $13.95 in 2023 dollars would be about $43. In the world before the internet or even Ticketron, you bought your tickets either at Disney World or at the customer service counter at Sears department stores, which often partnered with Disney for special events. It was a small party, targeted mostly to Florida locals. In fact, that first year, Disney only advertised the event in the Central Florida market. The company did include it in the Walt Disney World News, which was a newspaper and schedule guide guests received when they arrived at the resort. So the resort did pitch this event to guests already on property. But again, in the world before the internet, most traditional tourists from outside the area were utterly unaware that such a party was happening at the resort. For them, the winter holidays started the following day on December 17th. The following year, the party was also just one day, Friday, December 14th, but that was also the year that the park started to move the Christmas parade earlier. In 1985 and 1986, the party was again held on just one day, but then in 1987, the party was finally expanded to 2 nights, December 11th and 12th, still with gifts for all attendees and with red and green fireworks blossoming up behind the castle. This year, Mickey's Very Merry is big business. It has 25 dates from November 9th through December 22nd. It's slightly more expensive as well. The pricing varies depending on the date. Early dates are less expensive than later dates, but generally, adult tickets range from $159 to $199. Children are $149 up to $189, depending on the date. As with the early hard ticket events from Disneyland, the price range for this event is almost identical to what a one-day ticket would cost to the Magic Kingdom. There's some days where the hard ticket party is slightly less expensive than a day ticket to the park, but throughout the season the comparison is very close. The event this year is remarkably similar to the original Christmas party back in 1983. Once there, you can of course buy souvenirs and meals, but outside of that, most everything else is included in the price, as though the park is still hosting you. There are stations throughout the park where you can receive individually wrapped cookies. Within reason, you can have as many cookies as you want. If you want 2 at a certain station, just ask for them. Likewise, there are complimentary cups of hot chocolate, apple cider, and even eggnog this year. In previous years, there was a sugar-free hot chocolate option, but that isn't there this year. Likewise, everyone gets a souvenir ornament to take home. This year, it's a metal figure of a marching toy soldier. Are there nicer ornaments in some of the stores? Well, probably, but this is a very solid gift keepsake with strong design, nice detail, and some actual weight to it. I've placed mine on our tree here at the house. In my opinion, the main reason to visit a hard ticket party like this is to see a familiar park arranged to a new theme. That, I'd say, is the overriding appeal of the entire experience. If you visited the Magic Kingdom dozens or even hundreds of times, this is a way to make the experience feel fresh so that your eyes are continually drawn to new displays. To be honest, I think the Halloween party is a little more successful at transforming individual lands to create a unified mood throughout the park, but the Christmas party is more successful at transforming individual rides to create altered experiences. Some of these unique ride experiences are also available during the day, but others are only available during the party. At the top of my list this year is Space Mountain, which is transformed at night to present a holiday-themed light show. It's a lovely experience. In the launch tunnel, red and white lights surround your vehicle until you're lifted up into the dome. The interior of Space Mountain is lit with digital projections of snowflakes, as well as red and green spots which sweep through the building. But the lighting package is more than enough to clearly see the entire track and catwalk structure. If you've ever wanted to ride Space Mountain with the lights on, or perhaps with the lights half on, this here is your chance. During the day, the ride is a dark flight through space, and at the party at night, and this experience is exclusive to the party, the interior to Space Mountain is aglow with digital snow and colored spots, allowing you to see all the structure for the ride that you can't see during the day. The laugh floor, also in Tomorrowland, is reimagined as a holiday show, but the structure of the show and even the movements of the characters remain the same. It's the same CGI actors, but the backgrounds and the outfits are now keyed to the holiday. Roz is in her Christmas sweater, and the CGI backgrounds behind the comics are filled with enormous Christmas tree ornaments. It's a charming transformation filled with holiday jokes, even if the visual changes are minor. Likewise, the Tomorrowland Speedway is dressed with lawn decorations and lights. Some of these are unique creations, a pyramid of illuminated spheres, and white metal silhouettes of Christmas trees all in a row. Others are off-the-shelf string of lights that you can buy at Home Depot. But the overall effect here is lovely. Think of it as a drive through that neighborhood where each house has gone overboard with lights. Only here, your kids can drive the car by themselves. And the Jungle Cruise has been remade once again as the Jingle Cruise. The changes to those stages along the river are minor. That troop of gorillas camped out in that tent are now dressed in Santa hats and cranberry scarves. The gorillas are still inspecting that rifle and have left the Jeep as usual upside down. A little further down the river, the Lost Safari has left a stack of wrapped Christmas presents on the ground while they themselves remain in the tree above the rhino. And the monkeys in the indoor temple area now hold poinsettias and sport tiny Santa hats. But the most meaningful change is the script. It's an occasion to swap out some very familiar jokes with new holiday-themed ones. Most of the wait times for rides are very manageable. I waited 15 minutes for Space Mountain and about 10 minutes for the Jingle Cruise, though I did go on the Jingle Cruise toward the end of the night after many guests had left. During the peak of the evening, the wait for the Jingle Cruise was about a half hour. Beyond the attraction, the entertainment offerings are widespread and nearly continuous. Except for the first hour and a half of the party, you could spend your entire night with the seasonal entertainment. There are 2 shows on the castle forecourt. Frozen Holiday Surprise, in which Anna, Elsa, and Olaf light the castle with projections, and Mickey's Most Merry Celebration. The better by far is Mickey's Celebration, which features about 24 characters and performers, including all of the costumes that have mechanical heads that sync a character's dialogue and eye movements to a recorded soundtrack. These character heads are extremely expensive, but it is impressive to see Mickey, Minnie, Donald, and Goofy with their mouths moving, eyes blinking up on stage, perfectly timed to pre-recorded voices. The party has the usual Christmas parade along with holiday fireworks. The crowds are low enough so that you can easily find a good spot for both the parade and the fireworks 15 minutes before the show. For the parade, the crowds are lightest around Town Square. For the fireworks, I showed up 10 minutes before the show and found a spot in the castle forecourt right at the front of the hub. Lastly, there's character photo locations. You can snap a pic with Mickey in his holiday best with a wait time of 10 minutes, but the more popular character meet and greets, such as the one where Jack Skellington is decked out as Sandy Claus, have lines that can last hours. The first parade and fireworks are the big entertainment draws, dramas, so if you line up for rare character meetings about a half hour before either of these two shows, you'll find the shortest wait times for those characters for the entire evening. Even if you don't line up for a character meet and greet, in recent years, many guests have taken to dressing in Santa suits without beards, so there are literally dozens of mock Santas roaming the park at night. This is now a thing. Guests here simply want to participate by becoming part of the entertainment. Most of them, I'm guessing, would be happy to pose with you for a selfie. Included in the ticket price is everything that you'll need for an interesting night. Up to 8 hours in a park, a line of holiday snacks and drinks, robust entertainment, and even a keepsake ornament as a souvenir. When I was there last week, I bought a water, and that was it. Of course, I realize that many listeners are familiar with the overall flow of Mickey's Very Merry, but I'm laying it out here in detail for 3 reasons. First, so everyone can see how the Magic Kingdom is changing in small ways for the holiday season this year. Second, so those going to this event can plan out their night ahead. And lastly, so we here have a baseline to compare how successful or unsuccessful the new holiday party is over at Hollywood Studios when viewed against the history of Mickey's Very Merry. So let's switch over to Hollywood Studios because that's where all the interesting drama was earlier this year. The new event is called Jollywood Nights. Some of the differences between Jollywood and Mickey's Very Merry are easy to spot even before you step into the park. It's shorter than Mickey's Very Merry, lasting only 4 hours from 8:30 to 12:30 at night. Though for Mickey's, you can enter the Magic Kingdom 3 hours before the event. At Jollywood, you can officially enter the park only an hour before the party itself, though after the first night, they were a little more flexible about early entry. Part of the reason that the event doesn't have a generous early entry window is that Hollywood Studios is the smallest and often most crowded park on property. But another part of the reason, I assume, is to suggest that the party experience is a sharp departure from the daytime experience. And lastly, and here this is a big one, there are no children's pricing for the event itself, as there is for Mickey's. Kids can still go, of course, but this is Disney's not-so-subtle way of signaling that this event is primarily for adults, whereas Mickey's is for families with younger children. As you've probably heard, the first night was a minor fiasco in terms of organization. And here I want to talk about why this went so poorly. There were 3 elements in the lead-up that contributed to these problems. I'm going to make one assumption here, which I feel is very likely. I'm guessing that the team that crafted Jollywood looked at longtime guest patterns for Mickey's Very Merry. Specifically, I'm guessing that they looked at how many rides the typical guest experienced while they were at Mickey's Very Merry and assumed that patterns would be similar at Jollywood. And this is an important figure. If you have guests choosing to go on rides during the party, you need less unique experiences to satisfy the overall crowd. The Magic Kingdom does a very good job at enticing guests to go on rides, as they've dressed some of their rides and attractions for the holidays, such as the Tomorrowland Speedway and the holiday version of Space Mountain, which only has its interior holiday light package on during the party itself. So this strategy works well in the Magic Kingdom in terms of dispersing guests throughout the park and luring longtime Disney World regulars back onto rides and attractions that they've previously experienced in their regular form. In contrast, over at Hollywood Studios, there were no rides with seasonal overlays, let alone seasonal ride effects that are used only during the hard ticket party. Second, the planning team appears to have assumed that the first night would have a mix of guests who would largely experience the park in the manner of traditional tourists. As someone who has gone to many first night events and attraction openings, I can tell you that for about the last 10 years, these events have been filled with Disney vloggers, bloggers, TikTokers, and so on, as well as traditional media. Some high-profile social media influencers have their tickets comped, and in return, this group tends to give very positive reviews to Disney events. The idea of comping reviewers is nothing new for Disney. Walt did it for traditional press reporters when Disneyland opened back in 1955. But beneath this group of comped social media influencers is a very large number of people, often younger people, trying to develop a side hustle as up-and-coming influencers who will be deeply focused on experiences that bring more eyes to their platforms, which means those new experiences. This group of visitors overall simply doesn't follow the typical pattern of guests, which was another problem. And last, the artwork for the event overpromised what guests would experience. After artwork and descriptors were released, there were 3 areas that most interested fans. First was the otherworldly soiree at the Tip Top Club at the Tower of Terror. There are 2 main ways that fans previously knew about the Tip Top Club. First, it's listed in the tower's lobby directory in the building itself. The second way is this: the 1997 Disney made-for-TV movie called Tower of Terror. The film concludes with a trip back in time to that swanky Tip Top Club. In the movie, the Tip Top Club is a large indoor area with a full swing band and most guests dressed in formal wear. Whether the Disney marketing team realized this or not, the illustration they used to announce the Tip Top Club for Jollywood fit perfectly within the world of the Tower of Terror movie, as it featured a man in a tuxedo dancing with a woman in a long silver gown, while behind them in silhouette, a big band belted out the melodies. For many deep Tower fans, this signaled that the experience at the party would be somewhat similar to the experience in the film. Next on this list was Jazzy Holidays at the Hollywood Derby, which would feature holiday music performed by a pianist. Longtime park fans remember back to the park's early days, when there was a pianist regularly at the Derby. Part of the Derby, up by the front of the restaurant, has a permanent but now mostly unused piano stage, which was part of the restaurant's original design. So this too pushed the nostalgia button. And last, the Holidays and Hollywood artwork featured Kermit and Miss Piggy as the host of an outdoor musical review. This also engaged a key group of fans. In online groups and various social media discussions, these 3 aspects of the event were built up in such a way as to make them the key focus for first night visitors. And here's how that first night went down. Unlike the very first Mickey's Very Merry back in 1983, where at worst a negative review might show up the following day in a newspaper, the first night of Jollywood was live-streamed around the world, compliments of dozens and dozens of Disney vloggers, many of whom were comped into the park by Disney in the hopes that, as usual, they would support Disney's marketing efforts here. When the online media arrived and pointed their cameras at the park, one of the first things that viewers noticed was that very little in the park had changed or would be specifically dressed for the event. The decorations that were there were minor. At the entrance courtyard was a neon sign advertising Jollywood Nights that included the image of the event mascot, Ollie, which I think is a gingerbread man. But if someone told me it was a sugar cookie shaped like a gingerbread man, I'd go with that as well. If you've seen a photo of this neon without anyone standing next to it, it's easy to imagine it as a large piece of billboard artwork. But the gingerbread figure of Ollie is maybe 5 feet tall. It's wheeled out on a cart. The lack of overall decoration, similar to those at Mickey's Very Merry, was a small disappointment. But then came larger problems. The main point of distribution for party credentials, which was a lanyard and a wristband, and oddly you had to wear both, was at the park entrance, with only one location inside the park for guests who had entered earlier with a regular day ticket or an annual pass. But a significant number of first-night guests, of course, had annual passes, and around 7 p.m. started to line up inside the park at that one wristband distribution station. The line here quickly grew to 45 minutes, while the line at the front entrance remained about 5 minutes. Only hardly anyone in that 45-minute line knew they could get a wristband far quicker at the front of the park. This was yet another disappointment. After that, guests soon discovered that the Tip Top Club was nothing more than an outdoor area near the exit to the Tower of Terror, with a temporary band stage and a portable bar with exactly 3 bartenders. Cast members draped green and white bunting across the exterior of the tower at the exit area to dress it up a bit, but the effort was minimal. I should point out that the band that performs here, like all live music at the event, was absolutely superb, but this was not enough to satisfy guests there with tickets that cost over $150 per person. Also there at the Tip Top Club, the line for specialty drinks quickly grew to 25 minutes, as again there were only 3 bartenders staffing the area. This is where one of the underlying operating assumptions for the first night caused its own set of problems. Disney, no doubt, was expecting first-night guests to act like guests at Mickey's Very Merry, but the vloggers and bloggers all wanted to photograph, try, and review the party food and drink offerings. So every food and beverage location with unique offerings was quickly overwhelmed, largely with people toting cameras. At this point, those vloggers and bloggers, followed by thousands and thousands, were starting to voice their discontent about how the party was arranged. But it was the next problem that pushed most of the social media reporters over the edge, which was focused on jazzy nights at the Brown Derby. Restaurants at Disney have their own area inside the My Disney Experience app separate from those areas devoted to attraction operation. Or to put this directly, virtual queues are already wired into the attraction system, while the walk-up list is wired into the restaurant system. Because of this, for reservations at Jazzy Nights, Disney decided to use the existing walk-up list for the Derby on the MDE app, which has a fairly slow refresh rate, maybe a couple of seconds, as opposed to a virtual queue, which has a far quicker refresh rate. The system is geofenced, so that guests interested in signing up for a table at the Derby need to be somewhat close to the Derby. You can't reserve a table, for example, if you're standing over in Galaxy's Edge. Not that many guests were in Galaxy's Edge at all at any point during the night, but the geofence circumference for the Derby is reasonably small. On a typical night with an overall guest profile similar to that of Mickey's Very Merry, this plan would have worked well enough. But it was not a typical night. It was the party's first night filled with online media who understood exactly how the park works and knew when the walk-up window was set to open on the app. And Disney vloggers and bloggers, if nothing else, are really good at punching a reservation button on the app within 2 seconds of that reservation window opening up. I mean, they are really good at that. In fact, we've talked about how to do that on this podcast. But the walk-up reservation feature wasn't made for high-volume activity, nor did it have a quick refresh rate. And so, right when that window opened, within a couple of seconds, 270 groups hit that button before the system could update. All 270 groups were told that their table would be ready within 10 minutes. But there aren't 270 tables in the main seating area of the Derby. There's just over 70. If you figure that an average seating at the Derby is 40 minutes for this event, those initial reservations, taken in a couple seconds, would have likely filled up spots for most of the night, nearly 3 hours of reservations. Within minutes, there were hundreds of people, all of whom were told that their table was nearly ready, lined up all the way around the Derby building. Outside the Derby, other problems were starting to become apparent. Character greetings with rare characters were developing long lines. The line for Phineas and Ferb quickly grew to 2 hours, which is half the length of the overall party. Disney also passed a few key vloggers to the front of character lines, as they needed images to look good for some very large online audiences. But passing invited media to the front of long lines only angered other guests. The third area, the holidays in Hollywood, which I will point out is an excellent show and is filled with extremely talented musicians, only featured Kermit and Miss Piggy in a couple of segments, which for Muppet fans was another disappointment. During these hours, the rides at Hollywood Studios remained nearly empty. If you wanted to ride a Star Speeder over at Star Tours by yourself, you could do that over and over. Slinky Dog had a wait that was just a few minutes, and Runaway Railway was a walk-on. Planning called for these rides to soak up significant aspects of the crowd, but that first night crowd, nearly all of whom had been on every ride in the park many times, was solely focused on the unique shows, unique food and drink offerings, and the rare character greetings. The Holidays in Hollywood show was filled for each performance, but was never overwhelmed by crowds. Same for the Nightmare Before Christmas sing-along, but nearly every other unique party offering was awash with lines and crowds, to the point that it was uncomfortable. Also to the point where many guests found themselves unable to experience key offerings, such as the Derby, and unable to have photos at all character locations due to the lines. Disney, which monitored at least some of those online streams, watched as many of their loyal vloggers, who usually overlooked problems in the park to present overall positive reviews, one by one pointed out significant shortcomings for Jollywood Nights, with some calling the event a failure. At this point, I've been told managers started to meet backstage during the party itself to plan how to manage the ongoing fallout. But aside from giving extra access to key vloggers, there were few ways to fix the opening night's party. The night ended with cast members handing out parting gifts as guests left. The gifts were 2 wooden coasters decorated with the Jollywood Nights logo, but the parting gifts were far lower in quality and desirability than the metal ornaments received at Mickey's Very Merry. Over the past month, many of those metal ornaments from Mickey's Very Merry have sold for over $30 on eBay, whereas you can buy the set of 2 coasters unopened on eBay right now for $5. Simply, the coasters are not particularly well designed, nor particularly well made. Shortly after the first night's party, Disney sent out a survey, and for the life of me, I have to imagine that this survey was written before the event, as it was absurdly focused on how well guests liked the Jollywood Nights mascot Ollie, that gingerbread/sugar cookie figure. You could see Ollie as part of that 5-foot-tall neon sign near the entrance to the park, also as a plywood cutout in one of the grassy areas near the Derby. And the character design of Ollie was really at the bottom of the concerns for those who had attended that first night's party. Starting the day after the first Jollywood Nights, guests with tickets for later Jollywood Nights who had either seen, read, or heard about the opening night started calling Disney to ask if they could return their tickets. At this point, it was clear that though the first night, with the bloggers and vloggers, was designed to increase interest in Jollywood Nights, it was now causing the park to lose sales that it had already made. Depending on which rep guests talked to, they were given up to 3 options. They could trade in their Jollywood tickets for a night at Mickey's Very Merry that still had availability. They could return their tickets for a future credit toward an after-hours event later that year. And at least 2 guests were allowed to exchange their Jollywood tickets for regular day tickets. And this swapping of tickets caused a number of Mickey's Very Merry nights to sell out extremely quickly. As I record this on November 24th, 15 of the remaining 16 nights of Mickey's Very Merry are now completely sold out. And over at Jollywood, only one of the remaining nights is sold out, and that sold out event is on a Saturday. The rest of the Jollywood days have plenty of availability. The one bit of luck, which is likely good planning, that Disney managers had going for them was that they gave themselves a week break between the first and second Jollywood night parties to retool the event if necessary. Mickey's Very Merry, however, did back-to-back parties for its opening on November 9th and then again on November 10th. But managers over at Hollywood Studios gave themselves 7 days to figure out how to change the event before the second party happened. The easiest changes would simply be to hire more staff. Anything beyond that, such as with additional entertainment or more decorations, was beyond what could be easily accomplished in a week. Each of the first 3 nights had an unofficial theme. The first night was dominated by bloggers, vloggers, reporters, and social media. The second night, which was Saturday, November 18th, shortly before that wave of Thanksgiving tourists arrived, was largely filled with locals looking to experience something new. And that third night, which was the Monday of Thanksgiving week, attracted more traditional tourists in town for the holiday. So that second night, which was largely locals, was another night when guests would have minimal interest in rides and attractions and would be primarily drawn to unique party offerings. Again, most rides had little if any wait. But by this point, the planning team was at least better prepared for how this group of guests would experience the party. Though there were no additional decorations in the park, the operations team was better prepared for guests. As many locals have annual passes, this meant that many guests on that second night would get their wristband in the park. Now there were 2 distribution centers set up in the park, both of which were better staffed than the one on the first night. Next, the Derby. Starting on the second night, people could line up in person for the first round of seating. The line was just to the left of the Derby itself. I lined up at 7:10, almost an hour and a half before the party started. There were already 30 people in line. Doors opened to hand out reservations at 7:30, an hour before the party started. Cast members took your phone number and said that they would text you when your table was ready. And you also received an immediate confirmation text to make sure your phone number was correct. Once the people in the physical line were accommodated, the Derby again used the walk-up list in the reservation section of the MDE app, not a virtual queue, to take later reservations. But this didn't open until after the party started, at an unannounced time, which turned out to be around 9 o'clock. When those second round slots filled up, the walk-up list again closed and reopened about an hour later. The updated directions for the Derby were printed in a new version of the party guide, which I'm guessing meant that thousands and thousands of old party guides were recycled. On that second night, I've never seen so many managers on the floor of the Derby. Maybe half the staff that night was dressed in Derby server costumes. The rest were managers. If you want to experience jazzy nights at the Derby as part of Jollywood nights, I suggest that you line up in person when you get into the park. This is the surest way to make sure you have a spot for that experience. Next, the Tip Top Club. Again, at this point, it was impossible to change up the location of the club, but the number of staff for that outdoor bar was doubled. Twice the number of bartenders, twice the number of cash register attendants. I went through that line twice on the second night. Each time it took between 5 and 10 minutes. Again, I want to point out that the band that was performing there, which was Rachel and the Alley Cats, was absolutely fabulous. Some of the best music I've seen in the park in a long time. Likewise, the park expanded out the number of characters available for photos and greetings with some additional rare offerings such as Santa Stitch and Duffy in his Christmas wear. This was designed to reduce the overall wait times for other character greetings, and this partially worked. Some character greetings on that second night had wait times from between 5 to 10 minutes, but Phineas and Ferb had a line that filled up an hour before the party. At its worst, the line for Phineas and Ferb was about an hour long. But if you waited until the end of the party, that line shrunk down to about 15 minutes. Phineas and Ferb posed before a tree beside Echo Lake. At the top of the tree behind them is an image of Perry the Platypus as well. Though the standard rides and attractions remained mostly empty for the night, the party had little trouble with crowding for the two unique shows. Holidays in Hollywood, the show that fans thought would primarily feature Kermit and Miss Piggy, went off well. As with the Tip Top Club, the musicians here are fabulous, stellar voices, and a great live backing band. The problems here were one of expectations. The show, which runs about a half hour, is designed to present a live presentation of, I'm guessing, a mid-century TV holiday special, but Kermit and Miss Piggy have about as much time on stage as Mickey and Minnie, or Tiana, or Belle, all of whom have their own musical numbers. You could get in line about 10 minutes before the start of the show and still find a good seat. The other show, The Nightmare Before Christmas Sing-Along, never had a line. The show is primarily arranged around clips from the movie, but it does have two human actors who mime out their experience of watching the movie at home. The strongest part of that show, and perhaps the best reason to see it, is that it presents an oversized puppet of Jack Skellington. I've asked and still don't have confirmation, but I'm pretty sure that this is the same, or at least very similar to, the puppet that's used at Mickey's Not So Scary in the Castle show during Halloween. So if you want to see that amazing puppet up close, pick a seat up front on the left-hand side of the stage, and you'll be just a few feet away from it. For me, the most compelling aspect of the party that second night were the guests themselves. As I've mentioned, the first night was filled with bloggers and vloggers, many of whom have a signature style of dress. I don't know, think of, let's say, a neatly trimmed red beard and a Disney-themed Hawaiian shirt, something like that perhaps. But the second night was mostly Orlando locals who came in semi-formal and even formal wear, the type of outfits that one might wear to an elegant office party. And here is one of the things that I love about the Florida resort: the moments in which guests contribute to the atmosphere and elevate the experience. I kept a list that night of the various outfits I saw. Overall, it was a cross between Dapper Days and a traveling production of Newsies. Here's my list. Men in suspenders with polka dot bow ties, candy cane neckties and matching handkerchiefs placed in a chest pocket, men in tuxedo shirts and metal cufflinks, 3-button wool vest even though it was 75 degrees, newsboy caps, fedoras, and pork pie hats, women in New Year's gowns, dresses with sequins, shiny dresses made from satin and sequin fabrics, dresses with large starched bows on their backs at the waistline, which meant no rides on Slinky Dog, dresses, coats, and blouses made from lame, so much gold and red lame that I'm pretty sure Central Florida is heading into the largest lame shortage since the late 1970s. Not one person wearing a most expensive day ever t-shirt, nor a bibbity bobbity booze shirt, not even one with I so fly I never land. Very few people wearing on a shoulder sling souvenir character popcorn buckets, though I did see two. Also, a couple of men in complete Santa outfits who apparently were confused as to which party they were attending that night. In so many ways, the guests themselves, along with some stellar music, made the night a joy to attend. In many ways, this was one of my favorite experiences in a theme park in the last year. The third night, in terms of operation, was nearly identical to the second night, only the overall guest profile had changed. Many of these guests on that third night were traditional tourists whose airline-checked luggage likely didn't allow for formal or semi-formal wear. The third night felt far more like a typical night in the parks. Also, finally, guests started to migrate to more rides, which took pressure off the shows and party activities. Though the third night for this event was not sold out, the rides had far longer lines that night than they did at either of the first two parties. This was noticeable at nearly every ride and helped disperse crowds throughout the park. I saw one performance of Holidays in Hollywood that night where the theater was only 75% full. You could have arrived a minute before the show started and still found a reasonable seat. Both the second and the third nights were better managed than the first. Some of the problems were fixed and both nights were very enjoyable. But also the damage of the first night with wide-reaching reviews was already done, which translated into lower ticket sales and into some people exchanging their previously purchased tickets for other events. And even though I had a lovely time at later Jollywood nights, and even though I'd go so far to say that I personally had a better time at the adult-centered Jollywood nights this year than I did at Mickey's Very Merry, I also recognize that one of the issues here is one of value. The cost of Mickey's Very Merry and Jollywood is roughly the same, but Mickey's delivers more, which includes drinks, snacks, unique ride experiences, character photo opportunities, and an elaborate parade and shows which are arranged over a longer party period and in such a way that everyone there will be able to experience any holiday activity that they want without needing to be concerned that the reservation queue for that activity is full. So if you're more of a value-oriented Disney fan, you might want to weigh out those elements. But if you're more of a completionist, I'm already starting to wonder if, after that first night of reviews and lower ticket sales, if Jollywood Nights will even return next year. And if it does, I imagine it will be a far more robust experience with many things changed. Some obvious missed opportunities are the inclusion of the Star Wars Holiday Life Day in Galaxy's Edge, as well as a decoration package for Toy Story Land. But if you are interested in trying every experience at the resort, this really might be your one and only season to experience Jollywood. If you do go to Jollywood, go with reasonable expectations. Show up early, get in line for the Derby. The Derby presents two excellent pianists who alternating perform holiday standards. It's lovely. Check out Rachel and the Alley Cats over at the Tower of Terror. Holidays in Hollywood is a strong enough show to enjoy twice in the same night. Nightmare Before Christmas Sing-Along is primarily a film-based show, but that puppet at the beginning and at the end of the show is spectacular. And then enjoy the rides. On that third night, I walked onto Slinky Dog in about 20 minutes. Runaway Railway was a walk-on with no line at all, and Galaxy's Edge was unusually empty. It's the furthest from the holiday shows and the events. If you ever wanted to spend time in Galaxy's Edge without the crowds, this here is your opportunity. And lastly, if you're a value-focused tourist, one more option we haven't discussed is this. For a family of four, tickets to one party night at either park will run between $600 and $800 for all four people. You might find that money is better spent if you upgrade to a deluxe room or if you rent Disney Vacation Club points to stay at a DVC resort. The least expensive DVC studios to rent are at Old Key West and at Saratoga Springs. Typically, you can rent studio rooms at these two DVC properties for between $200 and $300 a night. I prefer Old Key West to Saratoga, but that's a personal preference. So if you were staying at an all-star resort for $150 a night for a 5-night trip, $600 to $800 should allow you to upgrade your resort to a DVC property. Guests at all deluxe and DVC resorts are allowed to attend extended evening hours at Disney parks. These typically happen twice a week at 2 different parks. You'll need to check the Disney World calendar. But instead of attending one of those Christmas parties, you might upgrade your hotel room and then have access to a couple nights of extended evening hours. Extended evening hours tend to have very low crowds, much like the Christmas parties, but without the Christmas extras. And this might be a better overall option for some visitors as compared to the Disney value hotels. You'll have a far larger room, a better feature pool with a slide, better dining options, and access to the parks on select nights after they close to other guests. There are many places to rent DVC points. If you've never done it before, I would recommend the DVC Shop and David's Vacation Club rentals. You can also rent them at a discount from people advertising on Facebook, eBay, or various Disney forums, but this route does have a little risk and is probably better for more experienced DVC renters. So with that, you have many options for Mickey's Very Merry, for Jollywood nights, or perhaps other ways to spend that money at the Disney resort. And with this, we are now at the end of our saga of Jollywood nights, which is the new, perhaps limited, event that kicks off this year's holiday season in Florida. I'll be back next week with a new episode. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studios and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes, but the best reason to become a Bandcamp subscriber is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly Bandcamp subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.